In the summer of 1940, when the Channel winds carried both the scent of sea salt and the murmurs of approaching disaster, Britain stood balanced on the thinnest edge between endurance and collapse. Yet in the dimly lit rooms of RAF Fighter Command headquarters at Bentley Priory, far from the brass-polished bravado of the political stage, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding orchestrated a defence built not on thunderous declarations, but on a quiet, meticulous conviction. The nation had no appetite for speeches. It needed survival. And Dowding understood that the sky would be the arena where Britain's fate would hang suspended like a fragile vessel caught in a storm. His silence was not absence, but intention, a refusal to waste breath when every second belonged to the men scrambling into hurricanes and Spitfires, their lives measured in the thin intersection between altitude and flame. Dowding was a man shaped by precision. He saw the war not as a spectacle of noise and fire, but as a system, a delicate web of observation posts, radar stations and squadron rotations that required a calm mind rather than a stirring tongue. While newspapers hunted for slogans and Parliament longed for thunder, he moved through map rooms where coloured markers crept across large plotting tables and the clatter of telephone relays formed the true soundtrack of Britain's resistance. He believed that strategy spoke louder than any orator, that clarity of method was more valuable than the rousing but empty echo of patriotic declarations. He cultivated discipline in silence, trusting that the men under his command would feel his resolve not through speeches, but through the quiet consistency of his leadership. As the Luftwaffe intensified its pressure, sending wave after wave of bombers protected by Messerschmitts that glinted like predatory birds in the sunlight, Dowding resisted calls to commit every squadron at once. He understood the mathematics of survival. He knew that a commander who fed his fighters into the fire in a single gesture of defiant bravado would condemn Britain within weeks. Instead, he built a system of rotation that kept pilots alive long enough to learn, adapt, and endure. Critics accused him of timidity, of lacking the spirit of reckless sacrifice that they romantically associated with war, but Dowding recognized that a romantic vision of heroism often produced nothing but empty graves. The true heroism, he believed, lived in the resilience of men who returned to the sky again and again, despite the weight pressing on their chests, despite the ghosts they carried each time they approached a still warm aircraft whose previous pilot had not returned. His silence became a kind of shield for those young men, many only 19 or 20, their faces still unfinished by adulthood, yet hardened by the knowledge that the next scramble bell could be the one that defined or ended everything. When they landed after combat, stepping out from cockpits stained with cordite, sweat and the trembling aftermath of survival, Dowding rarely greeted them with elaborate speeches. Instead, he offered the steady gaze of someone who understood exactly what they had endured and who respected them too deeply to dress their experience in theatrical words. Behind his calm eyes lived the weight of every casualty report, every empty bunk, every squadron reduced to half strength, yet still rising into the dawn with engines screaming defiance into the cold blue vastness. The British public knew little of him, and he preferred it that way. His war was not fought from podiums, but from dim corridors, where operational boards flickered with the movements of enemy formations. At night, he walked the quiet grounds of Bentley Priory, tracing invisible arcs through the darkness as if feeling the contours of tomorrow's battles with his fingertips. He thought often of the cost of command, of the invisible burden of sending young men into the sky, their aircraft rising like frail hopes against the massive machinery of the Luftwaffe. Yet he never allowed grief to crack his composure. He carried sorrow in the private chambers of his mind, letting only resolve surface. In that restraint lay his strength. As Britain waited, listening to the nightly rumble of distant engines and the staccato thumps of bombs falling on cities that crouched in blackout, Dowding shaped a defensive rhythm that became the heartbeat of the island. He watched the radar sweeps like a conductor listens to the orchestra before a crescendo. Every decision, the timing of a scramble, the commitment of reserves, the distribution of exhausted pilots to quieter sectors, formed part of a symphony of silent calculation. This was his speech, though it required no words, the measured choreography of survival. And so, while other leaders stirred crowds with declarations of defiance and destiny, Dowding wrote his message in the sky itself. Each contrail twisting in the upper atmosphere, each bomber turned back, each pilot returning with fuel fumes in his tank and relief pressed into the lines around his eyes. All of it served as testimony to a commander who believed history could be shaped quietly. His silence was not absence. It was discipline, intention, and love for a country he believed could be saved not by noise, but by precision. By the time August 1940 bled into September, the skies above Britain had become a shifting tapestry of fire and vapour. From Kent to Yorkshire, every dawn carried the possibility of annihilation. Yet beneath this chaos, Dowding's network, his silent machine of watchful eyes and invisible threads, was beginning to hum with the rhythm he had envisioned years before. The Dowding system, as it would later be known, was not merely a structure of command, but a living organism of coordination and trust. It stretched from the remote radar stations along the coast, where Women's Auxiliary Air Force operators watched ghostly blips slide across cathode screens, to the filter room at Bentley Priory, where those faint electronic whispers were transformed into real-time maps of threat and defense. Dowding had seen what few others had, that victory in the air would depend not on individual heroics, but on information, on speed, clarity, and restraint. The radar towers, known as chain home, rose against the grey horizon like modern cathedrals, their latticed steel frames humming with electricity and purpose. To many in government, they seemed obscure, even fragile. But Dowding knew that in their pulse lay the heartbeat of Britain's resistance. When the warning signals arrived, he did not rush to the telephone shouting orders or patriotic platitudes. He simply nodded, calculated, and deployed squadrons with mathematical precision, preserving his limited forces as if they were threads of gold spun too thin to waste. Each decision carried the weight of men's lives. The radar network gave him seconds, perhaps minutes, to decide who would face the approaching swarms. He listened to the quiet murmur of his operations officers reading incoming data, the words cutting through the air like whispered prayers. Raid heading east. Altitude 15,000. Probable strength 60 plus. The room pulsed with urgency but no panic. The clack of teletypes and the hiss of radio static became the sacred music of defense. He stood still amid it all, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the plotting table where coloured blocks shifted across the map. To those who served under him, Dowding's calm seemed supernatural, yet inside him storms raged, grief for fallen airmen, exhaustion from sleepless nights, and the gnawing fear that even his careful system might one day be overwhelmed by sheer numbers. It was not only machinery and data that sustained this defense, it was human endurance. The pilots of the RAF Fighter Command, young and brittle as the wings they flew, began to see Dowding not as a distant bureaucrat, but as the unseen guardian of their survival. They rarely heard him speak, but they felt his influence in the rhythm of operations that allowed them to fight, rest, and fight again. He refused to waste them in reckless glory. "A dead pilot," he once said quietly, "is of no use to Britain tomorrow." Those who lived through the battle would later say it was this restraint, this refusal to indulge in theatrical sacrifice, that gave them the strength to keep flying. Dowding's silence was not coldness but respect. His reticence was the measure of his care. As the raids intensified, so did the political pressure. Members of the Air Ministry, impatient for grand gestures, demanded aggressive counter-offensives. They wanted headlines, not endurance, but Dowding would not yield. He met their criticism with the same unflinching calm that marked his entire command. In quiet meetings, he explained that the Luftwaffe's strength lay in its numbers, and that Fighter Command's duty was not to seek glory, but to prevent invasion. "We are not here," he told them in a voice barely above a whisper, "to win battles in the newspapers. We are here to make sure there is still a Britain left to read them." Those words were not broadcast. They were not recorded. Yet within the walls of Bentley Priory, they settled like a vow. Meanwhile, in the fields and villages of southern England, civilians looked up at the dogfights overhead and prayed. Children collected shrapnel from fallen aircraft as trophies, unaware of the silent system that had kept their towns from destruction. When the newsreels showed burning aircraft spiraling earthward, the public cheered the visible courage of the few. But they never saw the man behind the curtain, the architect whose quiet insistence on coordination and conservation turned chaos into endurance. Dowding never sought that recognition or that. He remained a silhouette in the background, content that the system spoke for him, that every radar pulse, every timely interception, every pilot who returned home alive was his speech made manifest in action. At night, when the last reports were filed and the corridors of fighter command emptied, Dowding often lingered by the window of his office, watching the faint flicker of fires on the horizon, London burning, cities scarred by the price of defiance. He thought of his pilots sleeping in makeshift bunks, dreaming uneasy dreams filled with engines and smoke. He thought of the women in plotting rooms, their hands trembling slightly as they pushed markers across maps that represented life and death. And he thought of the silence he kept, wondering whether history would ever understand that silence had been his weapon, his shield, and his message all along. The web he had woven held, even as the pressure grew unbearable. And in the heart of that web stood Dowding, motionless, deliberate, and utterly alone, turning quiet observation into Britain's most vital act of resistance. If you're watching this far, tell me, where in the world are you joining from? I'd love to know where these stories of courage are reaching. By mid-September 1940, the air over England resembled a furnace of sound and smoke. Each day dawned with the promise of assault, sirens slicing through the fragile quiet, scrambling bells ringing across aerodromes where exhausted men slept in their flight gear, boots still stained with oil and mud. The Battle of Britain had reached its fiercest crescendo, and yet its architect, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, remained unshaken in his silence. While the nation listened to Churchill's defiant voice echo across the airwaves, Dowding spoke instead through the steady rhythm of radar blips, the calm issuing of orders, the precision with which his system countered chaos. His silence became its own kind of defiance, a whisper that carried through every command center saying, "Hold steady, think, endure." The public saw only fragments of the war above them. They saw contrails crossing like scars over the blue, heard the faint crackle of gunfire and the hollow thunder of engines. They watched from gardens, from rooftops, from shelter entrances, as fighters twisted through sunlight and shadow, small black specks against the infinite sky. But Dowding saw more. He saw the invisible threads binding every sector, every pilot, every station into one breathing organism of defense. He saw the data flow from radar towers to filter rooms, from observers' posts to the operations map, from there to the pilots who rose like falcons to meet the incoming storm. He saw the loss lists, names inked in black, sometimes 2 or 3 from the same squadron in a single day. And yet, he never allowed despair to breach his discipline. His leadership existed not in speeches or gestures, but in the controlled pulse of a nation refusing to yield. In the minds of his pilots, Dowding's image was distant but immutable. They called him Stuffy, a nickname born from his rigid manner, but secretly they revered him. They knew he was the reason they still had planes to fly, the reason their numbers were not spent recklessly for the sake of pride. When they returned from missions, faces grey with exhaustion, bodies trembling with the aftershock of adrenaline, they would see new aircraft waiting, new ammunition loaded, new replacements trained. Behind all that readiness lay Dowding's planning, his insistence that the system could not falter. He had turned fighter command into a living fortress, where silence and order fought side by side against fire and fury. Inside the war rooms, the air was thick with heat and fatigue. Cigarette smoke hung beneath the low ceiling like a permanent haze. The women of the WAF moved markers across the plotting table, each representing squadrons of men climbing into battle. They spoke in hushed tones, voices almost reverent, as if afraid to disturb the fragile balance between life and loss unfolding on the maps before them. Dowding moved among them quietly, nodding his approval, his gaze fixed on the intricate ballet of coloured blocks that mirrored the fate of his country. Each time the warning lights shifted from amber to red, he felt the same ache in his chest, the weight of command, the knowledge that he was sending men to meet death in the open sky. Yet he gave no speeches of encouragement, no hollow reassurances. He simply acted, believing that composure was the greatest mercy he could offer. The enemy was relentless. Goering's bombers filled the southern skies, their engines a droning promise of destruction. But for every formation that crossed the channel, Dowding's system answered with precision. The radar beams caught them long before they reached the coast. The operations room calculated their course, and the squadrons lifted to intercept at the exact moment needed. It was a dance of mathematics and instinct. Sometimes the timing faltered, sometimes the price was blood. Yet through it all, the pattern held. Britain did not break. Dowding's silent network absorbed the fury of an empire and returned it with restraint, discipline, and endurance. To those outside the command, the battle appeared spontaneous, 1,000 acts of individual bravery stitched together by chance. But Dowding knew better. Every interception was born from calculation, every success from his refusal to waste even a single life in unnecessary risk. He understood that his young pilots, the few, were not symbols to be sacrificed, but living instruments of defense. They carried not only Britain's safety, but its dignity. He once wrote, quietly and without ceremony, that his greatest fear was not defeat, but squandering these men through pride. That belief guided every decision he made, even when critics accused him of cowardice or excessive caution. He did not argue. He simply continued his work, trusting that history would one day understand the value of restraint. And history did. The tide began to turn as the Luftwaffe faltered, its formations breaking under the combined pressure of exhaustion and British precision. The German pilots, expecting an easy conquest, found themselves trapped in a war of endurance they could not win. Meanwhile, the people of Britain, bruised but unbroken, began to sense a shift in the wind. The sirens still wailed, the bombs still fell, but hope began to glow in the darkness, a fragile, flickering light that refused to die. In every quiet moment between raids, when Londoners stood among the ruins and looked skyward, they could almost feel the presence of the silent man who had guided their salvation without ever needing to speak. Dowding's silence had become the very voice of Britain's resistance. It whispered through the wind that carried the sound of Spitfires, through the static of the wireless, through the prayers murmured in shelters. It said, "We endure, we think, we fight with calm hearts." And in that quiet endurance, Britain found not only survival, but identity. If you've made it this far into the story, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps these forgotten chapters of history reach more hearts. The autumn of 1940 descended upon Britain like a veil of ash and fire. The fields turned from green to bronze under a sky that no longer promised weather but war. Every dawn began with the same ritual: the dull moan of distant sirens, the shudder of anti-aircraft guns, the slow rising hum of engines somewhere over the channel. It was the sound of an island breathing through clenched teeth. And still, in the heart of this unending storm, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding remained silent. While politicians and generals demanded declarations, morale speeches and public gestures, he sat within the subdued light of Bentley Priory, surrounded by maps, telephones and exhausted officers. His silence was not indifference. It was the only calm that could hold back chaos. The Luftwaffe had turned its fury from the airfields to the cities. London burned nightly, its streets strewn with glass and ash, its people sleeping in the underground tunnels like a hidden nation beneath the earth. The newspapers called it the Blitz, but for Dowding it was simply the next phase in a long equation of endurance. He watched reports pour in, damage tallies, casualty counts, fuel shortages, and he knew the enemy's strategy: to break the spirit of a nation by setting its capital aflame. Yet he also knew something deeper, something the German command had never understood. Britain's strength was not measured in speeches or in visible triumphs, but in quiet perseverance, It was the stubborn resolve of ordinary men and women who woke after each bombing, brushed the dust from their clothes, and carried on. His own silence mirrored theirs. Inside the war rooms, fatigue began to erode even the most disciplined minds. Some officers wept quietly after long shifts. Others fell asleep over plotting tables, their faces pressed against maps inked with destruction. Dowding's own features grew thinner, his eyes darker, his posture slightly bent from sleepless nights, but he refused to falter. He would walk slowly around the room, placing a hand on a shoulder here, a quiet word there, simple gestures that spoke more powerfully than any rallying cry. He understood that leadership was not noise, but presence. Those who served under him began to draw strength from his composure. Even when the pressure grew unbearable, when losses mounted and resources dwindled, Dowding's measured tone never changed. Beyond the command walls, Britain's pilots fought until their nerves frayed to threadbare edges. Many flew 4, 5, even 6 sorties a day. They learned to recognize each other's aircraft by the dents in their fuselages, by the smell of fuel that clung to their gloves. When one failed to return, his bunk was left untouched for a day before someone quietly folded the blanket and removed the nameplate. Dowding received these reports in silence. He would read each name, pause for a moment, and then turn the page. It was not hardness. It was ritual, the only way to keep grief from collapsing into despair. He carried those names like invisible weights inside him, each one a pulse in the great quiet machine he had built to keep Britain alive. In the midst of the Blitz, visitors arrived from the Air Ministry, their briefcases full of proposals and criticisms. They spoke in polished sentences about strategy and morale, about the need for offensive operations and public reassurance. Dowding listened patiently, his face a study in restraint. When they finished, he would simply say, "My duty is defense," and return to his maps. It infuriated them, this quiet defiance, this refusal to indulge in rhetoric. But Dowding knew that victory was not won through appearances. It was won through the small, invisible decisions that no one noticed at the time. He let the politicians handle words. His own battlefield was made of silence and discipline. The pilots called him the old man, half in jest, half in reverence. They rarely saw him, but when his presence rippled through the bases, when a message arrived bearing his signature, or a rumor spread that he had intervened to protect their rotation schedules, they felt a surge of reassurance. He was the invisible architect of their endurance, the man who understood that fatigue could kill as surely as bullets. His orders to rest squadrons, to repair instead of replace, were acts of compassion disguised as strategy. In those decisions lay the seed of Britain's survival. By late October, the Luftwaffe's momentum began to falter. The weather turned cruel, grounding many operations. The German pilots, once brimming with arrogance, grew weary. Their formations became erratic, their morale fractured. Dowding watched from Bentley Priory as the radar plots thinned, the intensity of attacks fading like a storm running out of sky. He did not celebrate. There was no declaration of triumph, no dramatic gesture. He merely nodded to his officers, who understood what that nod meant. The worst was passing. Britain had endured. And yet, amid the relief, Dowding felt only exhaustion. He had spent everything, every ounce of intellect, every hour of sleep, every fragment of himself, on holding the line. He had fought a war not of words but of waiting, of listening, of anticipating the next move. When he finally allowed himself a moment to breathe, he walked outside Bentley Priory into the thin autumn light. The gardens were littered with fallen leaves, the air still carrying the faint rumble of distant guns. For the first time in months, he looked up at the sky not as a map or a battlefield, but as a living thing. It was pale and vast and, for once, empty. He closed his eyes and listened. There was no sound, no engines, no alarms, no shouts, only silence. The same silence that had guided him through the fire now enveloped him like a benediction. It was not victory he felt, but release, the quiet knowledge that his faith in restraint, in thought over passion, had held. The storm had passed, and the stillness he had always trusted had finally returned to the sky. When the roar of the Luftwaffe faded into history and the autumn sky turned serene once more, Britain breathed, but Dowding did not. His body remained in the war even after the war had passed him by. The airfields that once trembled with takeoffs now lay quiet, their tarmac littered with the ghosts of burnt tires and the laughter of men who would never return. Across southern England, church bells rang in cautious relief, and newspapers hailed the few with headlines that glowed with gratitude and pride. Yet in Bentley Priory, Dowding sat alone at his desk, surrounded by reports that felt less like triumph and more like an inventory of loss. For him, victory carried no music. It was measured not in headlines, but in the faces of the living, and in the names of the dead that haunted the margins of every page. He had won without spectacle, and in doing so, had made enemies among those who craved it. The silence that had saved Britain now turned against him, recast as aloofness, arrogance, even weakness. Within the Air Ministry, whispers began to circulate that Dowding was too slow, too cautious, too unwilling to take the fight into the heart of Germany. He had refused to gamble lives for glory, and that refusal, in the aftermath of survival, was seen not as wisdom, but as timidity. Men who had once questioned his system now claimed it as their own invention. Those who had doubted him now positioned themselves as visionaries. Dowding made no protest. He simply continued to work, his pen scratching across memos, his eyes growing dim under the yellow glow of his lamp. He had never spoken loudly, and he would not begin now. The strain had left marks that no uniform could conceal. His shoulders stooped slightly, his voice had grown hoarse, and deep shadows framed his eyes. When he walked the corridors of Fighter Command, younger officers looked away out of respect or pity. They could see the fatigue that victory had not erased. At night, he dreamed of radar screens flickering endlessly, of dots on a plotting table moving too fast to track. Sometimes he woke convinced he still heard the clatter of teletypes, the scratch of pencils marking lives on maps. His silence, once a weapon, had become a prison. But even in solitude, he found a certain grim satisfaction. The system had worked, the country had stood, and the men he had protected had lived to see peace, or something like it. Yet peace was not kind to him. The machinery of politics moved quickly to reshape the narrative. Committees and inquiries examined his methods, dissecting decisions made under fire with the cold detachment of hindsight. Younger, more ambitious officers emerged, men like Leigh Mallory, who promised a more aggressive doctrine, who spoke the language of expansion and offence. They smiled, shook hands, and quietly prepared Dowding's dismissal. He saw it coming long before it arrived. He read it in the polite vagueness of memoranda, in the way colleagues avoided his gaze, in the sudden formality of letters that once carried warmth. When the order finally came in November 1940, relieving him of command, he accepted it with a faint nod and no complaint. There was no ceremony, no farewell parade. He simply gathered his papers, thanked his staff, and walked out of the building that had been the nerve centre of Britain's survival. Outside, the air was cold and clear. He paused for a moment at the gate of Bentley Priory, his hand resting on the iron rail. Behind him, the war room still buzzed with the quiet hum of machinery, the system he had built continuing to breathe without him. That was his legacy. A structure that did not depend on personality, that spoke through discipline rather than applause. He had created something that could outlast even its creator. Yet as he walked away, the silence he had once commanded seemed heavier, almost cruel. The gratitude of a nation rarely extends to those who serve without spectacle. In the months that followed, Dowding withdrew into the stillness that had always been his refuge. He lived quietly, refusing interviews, avoiding the spotlight that now illuminated others. Sometimes he visited the airfields where his pilots had fought, watching the new recruits training beneath skies that were once scarred by fire. He would stand at the edge of the runway, hands clasped behind his back, his greatcoat drawn tight against the wind, and simply watch the planes lift into the air. The sound of their engines filled him with both pride and melancholy. He had built the shield that allowed them to fly freely, Yet he knew that his own time had already passed into history. But history, as always, moves slowly toward justice. The men who had served under him remembered. They told their children and their children's children of the quiet man who had saved Britain not through speeches, but through stillness. They spoke of how he refused to send them to pointless deaths, how he valued their lives as much as the land they defended. Pilots who had once cursed his caution came to understand that it was his restraint that had kept them alive. Over time, Dowding's silence began to echo again, no longer as absence, but as reverence. The nation that had forgotten him began, decades later, to remember. Statues were raised. His name was spoken again with respect, and yet, in every telling, the same truth endured. He had never sought to be remembered at all. In his final years, Dowding often sat by a window overlooking the English countryside, where the light shifted slowly across the fields. Sometimes he would close his eyes and imagine the radar pulses sweeping the coast once more, the young voices on the radio calling out vectors, the low hum of engines carving the future from the air. And though the world around him had changed, that inner stillness remained, the same quiet conviction that had once saved an island from fire. Years passed, and the smoke of war settled into the soft haze of memory. England rebuilt itself, brick by brick, voice by voice. Children played in streets once cratered by bombs, their laughter mingling with the distant drone of civilian aircraft tracing peaceful paths across the sky. Yet for Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, peace remained a stranger. The silence he had once commanded now stretched endlessly before him, a vast and echoing chamber where the ghosts of the Battle of Britain spoke in whispers only he could hear. Each morning he woke early, not because he wished to, but because habit compelled him. The discipline that had guided fighter command now ordered his quiet, solitary days. He walked often through gardens or along the stone paths of small English villages, his coat collar turned up against the chill. Strangers rarely recognized him. Those who did were surprised by his gentleness. He seemed smaller than the legend, slower, almost fragile. But behind his reserved eyes, there lingered the unyielding precision that had once held an empire's fate in balance. He would sometimes pause, looking skyward, tracking the contrails of airliners as if they were fighter formations. And for a fleeting instant, he was back in the war room at Bentley Priory, the plotting table glowing, the phones ringing, the voices murmuring coordinates into the dark. Then the vision would fade, leaving only the sound of birds and the whisper of wind through trees. He rarely spoke of the battle. When pressed, he would answer in measured tones, offering no drama, no self-glorification. "I merely did what was necessary," he would say, almost apologetically. To those who listened closely, there was both pride and sorrow in those words, a recognition that necessity often demands the parts of ourselves we can never reclaim. His friends noticed how he would drift into silence during conversations, as though his thoughts were tuned to some distant frequency, still echoing from 1940, and perhaps they were. He had lived for so long inside calculation and consequence that ordinary life, with its noise and trivialities, felt strangely foreign. In public, the world had moved on. Politicians, commanders, and historians debated new wars and new doctrines. Dowding's name appeared occasionally in articles or footnotes, a figure of quiet controversy, admired by some, misunderstood by others. He never defended himself. History, he believed, would speak eventually, and it did, though far later than he deserved. As Britain entered the decades of remembrance, as monuments rose and documentaries sought the human stories behind the victory, his name began to re-emerge, not as the forgotten bureaucrat, but as the silent strategist who had woven Britain's salvation from logic and faith. The pilots who survived became his living legacy. They spoke of his patience, his refusal to waste them, his quiet compassion disguised as command. Many of them visited him in his final years, their once youthful faces lined by time, but still brightened by the same gratitude. He greeted them all with that same calm warmth that had once steadied them before battle. Sometimes they would sit together in silence, watching the twilight gather over the hills. The men who had once faced death daily found comfort in his stillness. It reminded them that courage did not always shout. One of them once said, "He never told us to be brave. He showed us how." Dowding merely smiled at that, saying nothing. But inside, perhaps, he felt a quiet vindication, that silence could indeed be the loudest proof of faith. In 1969, when he passed away, the world mourned quietly. There were tributes in Parliament, in newspapers, in the Royal Air Force itself. Yet the truest eulogies came not from speeches, but from the sound of aircraft flying overhead at his funeral. A formation of Spitfires and Hurricanes, their engines merging into a low, solemn hum that rolled across the sky like a final salute. Those who listened said it felt as though the air itself had bowed in gratitude. Today, when visitors walk through the preserved war rooms at Bentley Priory, they can still feel him there, the maps, the plotting tables, the silence that fills the halls, all seem to carry an invisible presence. His spirit lingers not as an echo of command, but as a reminder that victory is often built on patience, humility, and thought. The radar screens are dark now, but in the still air of those rooms, one can almost hear the faint, rhythmic pulse of the system he created, the heartbeat of a nation that refused to die. Hugh Dowding's story endures not because he spoke, but because he listened, to data, to instinct, to conscience. His genius lay not in shouting above the noise of war, but in hearing what others ignored. The quiet voice of reason amidst the thunder of chaos. His legacy is the sky itself, free and vast, its silence no longer fearful, but sacred. The silent strategist had not merely defended Britain, he had defined it. Long after the last Spitfire had landed, and the thunder of the war had been swallowed by history, Britain carried on beneath skies once torn by fire. Cities rose again, laughter returned to streets once scarred by bombs, and the people learned to live with the memories that time could soften but never erase. Yet somewhere, beyond the noise of post-war life, there remained an echo, a quiet pulse that seemed to hum within the very air, a remembrance not of words, but of will. That echo was Dowding's voice, still silent, still steady, still guarding the sky. His story was never written in the language of victory parades or political triumphs. It was written instead in the unseen hours before dawn, in the hum of generators at radar stations, in the trembling hands of women who plotted raids with pins and pencils, in the discipline of pilots who took to the air with nothing but courage between them and eternity. Dowding's silence had threaded through all of them, a steady current of composure holding chaos at bay. When the world around him demanded noise, he answered with order. When others sought glory, he sought endurance. And in doing so, he had preserved not only a nation, but the idea of restraint itself, the notion that wisdom could be stronger than fury, that reason could triumph over rage. There is something profoundly British in that kind of quiet heroism. The refusal to make a spectacle of suffering, the calm insistence on doing what must be done without applause. Dowding embodied it so completely that it nearly consumed him. He gave his life's calm to the defense of a people who would only much later understand what they owed him. He did not need their gratitude. He only needed to know that the skies remained free. In his silence, there was no bitterness, only a kind of austere grace. It is the silence of the sea after a storm, the silence of dawn after a long night of fear, the silence that follows survival. When historians later tried to summarize the Battle of Britain, they often quoted Churchill's famous line about the few. Yet beneath that line, unspoken but present, was the foundation Dowding had laid. The quiet system, the invisible network, the discipline that turned a desperate defense into an enduring legend. His triumph was not born from charisma or rhetoric, but from the steady rhythm of thought, patience and faith. He had looked into the abyss, measured its depth, and calmly built a bridge across it. If one stands today on the cliffs of Dover at sunset, when the air turns gold and the sea mirrors the sky. One can almost feel it still, the quiet vigilance that once watched over that horizon. The same wind that carried the roar of engines in 1940 now carries peace, but within it lingers that faint hum of history. Dowding's legacy lives not only in statues or plaques, but in every aircraft that crosses that sky, in every generation that inherits the freedom he secured without ever raising his voice. The silent strategist taught his country that strength need not shout. He taught that leadership could dwell in the measured heartbeat, in the whispered command, in the unseen courage of those who act while others speak. And though the decades have blurred the details of those days, the essence remains. The victory of 1940 was not merely one of machines or men. It was a triumph of temperament, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful act of defiance is to remain calm when the world is burning. So let the history books tell of speeches and dogfights and flames in the night, but let us remember also the man who stood apart, listening, calculating, believing. His silence was not emptiness. It was the sound of resolve, the sound of a nation breathing through the storm. Hugh Dowding never needed to speak for Britain. He let the sky speak for him. And in that boundless, wordless expanse, his legacy endures still, unbroken, unspoken, everlasting. If this story moved you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Every story we tell keeps history alive, and sometimes the quietest voices are the ones that must be heard the most.